I'm Edward Herman for the A&E Cable Network. Welcome to Our Century. In 1924, the Russian people had been through 2 revolutions and a civil war. The first revolution toppled the Czar and ushered in a young democracy. Only a few months later, the Bolsheviks under Vladimir Lenin decided that the time was right for a real revolution on their terms. So began Soviet Russia and an armed conflict between the Reds and the anti-communist Whites. In our second episode, that conflict is now over. Russia is red. But Lenin is dead, and another conflict is about to begin. The struggle now is not for the nation, the struggle is for personal power. Who will succeed Lenin? Join us now for episode 2 of Stalin, the Red Tsar.
In January 1924, Lenin, founder of the Soviet Union, died. His widow, Nadezhda Krupskaya, watched his disciples carry his coffin from the sanatorium where he had spent his last days. A special train was to bear it to Moscow past crowds stricken with grief. Less than 7 years earlier, he had led the Bolsheviks to victory in the world's first Marxist revolution. He had replaced Tsarist autocracy with the dictatorship of the Communist Party, and come to fill, in the minds of his people, the place left vacant by the Tsars. Now he was gone, leaving behind no obvious heir. The 5 men who had run the country during the last months of his illness were disunited on what to do with Russia next. And Lenin had made the problem worse by laying down no clear line on the issue of the succession in the notes he had dictated before his death about his close disciples. Comrade Trotsky is without doubt the most able man in the party's Central Committee, but he is also distinguished by his too far-reaching self-confidence. Lenin had said about the leading radical of the party. Lenin's right-hand man in the 1917 revolution, and his Commissar of War since, Trotsky was feared by the rest of the leadership as Lenin's natural successor. Comrade Bukharin is the favorite of the whole party and its greatest and most able theoretician. But his views can only with very great doubt be regarded as truly Marxist. Lenin had said about the youngest member of the communist ruling group. He was the editor of Pravda, the party paper, and the chief hope of the moderates. Between these 2 extremes of the political spectrum stood 3 men, chiefly united by their determination to stop Trotsky. Lev Kamenev, Lenin's brother-in-law and the man in effective charge of the government during the last few years of Lenin's life. Grigory Zinoviev, an equally long-term associate of Lenin and president of the Communist International. And Joseph Stalin. He was the least well-known of the 5 rivals, but powerful as the boss of the party machine. Lenin had said little about Kamenev and Zinoviev in the notes that came to be seen as his will. But he had harsh words for Stalin made General Secretary of the party on Lenin's own recommendation in 1922. Stalin is too rude, and this fault, though permissible in us communists, becomes unbearable in the office of the General Secretary. I propose that the comrades find a way to remove Stalin from the position and appoint to it another man, someone more patient, more loyal, more polite, more attentive, less capricious. But far from being ousted from his job, Stalin was to rise in the next 5 years to rule the country more dictatorially than Lenin had ever done. Stalin's first task was to survive in his post as boss of the party machine in spite of Lenin's will. At a special meeting of the party's Central Committee in May 1924, Stalin and his allies put into action their plan to prevent Lenin's will being carried out. It was a dramatic occasion, as Boris Bazhanov, Stalin's personal assistant at the time, remembers.
Когда Каменев прочел завещание Ленина,
after Kamenev had read the will, there was painful silence. Then Zinoviev took the floor and began to speak. He said, "Comrades, you know that we have sworn to carry out Lenin's will in every respect, and we will carry it out. Every word of his is law to us. But we are happy to be able to say that his fears regarding our General Secretary have turned out to be unfounded, and that our General Secretary has worked together with the Central Committee splendidly over the last few months and without any friction." Everyone knew that this was not true. The struggle against Trotsky and for the succession was raging, and people lowered their eyes. Trotsky considered the whole thing a comedy beneath his contempt, and the expression on his face showed his disgust. But he said nothing. Stalin sat at the edge of the rostrum and was staring out of the window. His expression was strained. His fate hung in the balance. Would he remain in power or not? He remained silent, looking out of the window. The question was put to the vote immediately. The Central Committee voted that Stalin should remain General Secretary. There was no debate. And that's how Zinoviev saved Stalin.
Таким образом, Зиновьев Сталина спас.
But the real struggle for power went on, under the guise of a fierce debate on how to realize Lenin's dream, the building of a socialist Russia. Trotsky, a brilliant orator, was campaigning for a rapid push towards socialism. Bukharin, the economic brain of the party, was for gradual progress. Stalin, without ideas of his own to contribute, exploited the differences among his rivals with ruthless opportunism. First, he outmaneuvered the radicals by relying on the moderates. Then he not only used the radicals' ideas to get rid of the moderates, but also went on to put these ideas into practice in a more extreme form than the radicals had ever envisaged. The country whose fate the Bolsheviks were debating seemed an unlikely candidate for becoming the land of socialism. Marx had envisaged socialism as the final stage of industrial civilization. Russia at the time of Lenin's death was a vast peasant empire, a whole epoch behind the West in development. Peasants made up 4/5 of the population. During the Civil War, they had given their support to the Bolsheviks, who had done away with the landlords. But they were interested only in holding on to their share of the landlords' estates, not in seeing Russia become a socialist country. And though they lived better than before, they produced little more food on their small plots of land than what they and their families ate. Russia's industry had begun to grow rapidly at the turn of the century, but it was then ruined by 6 years of war, revolution, and civil strife, which also thinned out the ranks of the industrial proletariat. The Bolsheviks had started to reconstruct Russian industry, but output was still far below levels reached before the First World War. In the face of this situation, Trotsky called for radical methods. He demanded rapid industrialization, financed out of heavy taxes on the peasantry. And he pressed for continued pursuit of the old Bolshevik dream of world revolution to unite the industrial countries of the West and backward Russia in a socialist commonwealth. But the country wanted peace and an easier life, not more campaigns after years of war, revolution, and social upheaval.
Our century will continue in a moment on A&E. The Red Czar.
Russia had taken eagerly to the policies introduced by Lenin in the early 20s to revitalize the economy after the Civil War. These meant a retreat from Marxist-type state control, but led to an economic boom. In industry, private and nationalized firms competed with each other. Shops were nearly all in private hands. Peasants could sell their produce in town markets freely and for a good price. All this gave neither the masses nor even the party membership much appetite for the radical ideas of Trotsky. It was this new mood of the party membership that Stalin and his allies moved to exploit when they turned Lenin into a cult figure and accused Trotsky of trying to steer the Soviet Union off the road marked out for it by its founder. Trotsky's demand for industrializing the country at the expense of the peasants would, they said, wreck the so-called Peasant-Worker Alliance, the basis of Lenin's more relaxed economic policies. And in place of Trotsky's idea of world revolution, they launched the slogan of socialism in one country. Russia was alone, they explained. No help from the Western proletariat would be forthcoming. Instead of trying to set fire to the rest of the world, the country should settle down to building socialism by itself. This was a daring as well as a reassuring concept. It held out before Russia's masses the prospect of peace instead of revolutionary campaigns, and the vision of their backward country rising to lead mankind towards its socialist future. It combined the Marxist idea with an old mystical view Russians held of their country as destined to redeem the world. Trotsky's past, especially his disagreements with Lenin before the revolution, were at the same time being raked up by his enemies. In all this, Stalin let his allies do the shouting, while he got on with securing his grip on the party. Stalin used his hold on the party machine to force Trotsky to resign as Commissar of War in January 1925. As soon as Trotsky was out of the race for the succession, Stalin turned against his former allies, Kamenev and Zinoviev. They responded by taking up Trotsky's radical ideas, demanding rapid industrialization and the grouping of Russia's millions of peasants in collective farms. Stalin used this to denounce them as fanatical industrializers out of touch with the needs of Russia and enemies of the Russian peasant. In 1926, he forced Kamenev and Zinoviev out of the Politburo, the party's inner cabinet. In getting rid of the radicals, Stalin had relied on Bukharin, the leading moderate in the party and his only remaining rival. For the next 3 years, they ruled Russia together, Bukharin making policy and Stalin supplying the organizational muscle. Bukharin believed in encouraging the peasants to produce more food for the towns by paying them higher prices. He was telling them to grow prosperous and wanted to see them modernize their farms. And he wanted to see Russia evolve gradually into a socialist country rather than forcing the pace. So he gave free enterprise scope and let the country enjoy the relaxation of controls originally introduced by Lenin. But the policies pursued by Stalin and Bukharin ran into trouble in 1927 when Russia found itself facing an economic crisis. There was growing unemployment in the towns, and shortages of both industrial goods and food combined with inflation to produce misery. The crisis had a profound effect on the party. The views of the membership shifted towards the radicals' demands. They now wanted a comprehensive program of industrializing Russia to wipe out unemployment and of raising agricultural output to feed the towns. At the same time, Russia's isolation from the West was generating fears of a major war with the capitalist world. This was the mood that gave rise to the idea of a 5-year plan. It was to harness all of the country's resources to a vast effort of turning Russia into an industrialized fortress of socialism. The idea of a 5-year plan caught the party's imagination, but its details went on being furiously debated and radically altered even after the plan had begun to be put into practice in 1928. The party's left demanded a faster and faster pace as a response to the crisis facing Russia, and regardless of whether this made economic sense. There are no fortresses the Bolsheviks cannot conquer, was their slogan. Bukharin rejected the ideas of the left as economic romanticism, likely to lead to disaster. But the industrializing fever had got hold of the party, and it gave Stalin his chance to move against his last remaining rival. Having ousted Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev as reckless radicals, Stalin now put himself at the head of the party's left and accused Bukharin of sabotaging the transformation Russia needed. Backed by the fervent support of the radicals, in 1929, Stalin turned Bukharin out of the Politburo. And so, at the age of 50, Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, the shoemaker's son from Georgia, and the man Lenin had least wanted to have succeed him, was in complete control of Russia. His birthday in December 1929 was turned into a feast of adulation for the man party officials now began to call Khazyain, the master. The long debate was over, and the time had come for action in obedience to a single will. In the next 5 years, Stalin drove Russia into a second revolution, more sweeping and far more violent than had been the upheaval of 1917. He seemed intoxicated with the idea of turning Russia from a peasant empire into an industrial power, ready under his leadership to challenge the capitalist world. So he took the radicals' ideas and pushed them to their logical extremes, which lay beyond the borders of sanity. And instead of recoiling from the bedlam that ensued, he seemed to revel in orchestrating it as a task fit for a giant.
Our century will continue in a moment on A&E.
His first priority was agriculture. Russia needed to produce more food, and it also needed capital for its industrialization drive. Both could only come from the peasants, and the Bolshevik plan was to make them produce more at lower costs. But to try and increase efficiency while drawing off the peasants' earnings, the party had to bring them under its firm control. So the Bolsheviks decided to replace Russia's patchwork of millions of small peasant holdings with collective farms. Nor was this just an economic move. The Bolsheviks saw Russia's deeply religious peasantry as the bulwark of attitudes they meant to abolish. The peasants, 4/5 of the population, went on living their lives as they always had. So the Bolsheviks regarded collectivization as carrying their revolution to the countryside, to replace the traditional attitudes with a new socialist outlook. What Stalin did was to speed up the plans, mixing persuasion with brute force. Leoka Rish was a young farmer in the Ukraine at the time.
В першу чергу взялися за таких середнячків, як оце, скажімо, я, щоб ви мали трошки більше землі там чи що.
Every evening, a party member came from town to our village. He would call a meeting and try to talk us into joining the collective farm, painting a picture of the wonderful life we poor people would have there. But most people didn't believe him, and only a few of the more naive among us joined the collective. Then the district authorities called out a whole squad of activists from town. They wrenched the locks off our stable doors, took away our horses, and led them to the farmyard of the collective. And they said to us, "These horses are not yours now. If you take them back, you will be dealt with like thieves." People were stunned. There was nowhere to turn for help, no way of deliverance from this evil. Some, in despair, committed suicide.
The Bolsheviks saw themselves bringing the peasants a new way of life. To the peasants, they were intruders who had come to destroy all that was most sacred. When peasant resistance showed itself, the Bolsheviks regarded it as an attack on the party's rule. They answered it with violence by the squads of enthusiastic activists and detachments of the police. So collectivization turned into a war between the peasantry and the party. Whole villages were razed with artillery fire or burned to the ground. Better-off peasants, the so-called kulaks, were herded off to forced labor camps en masse. Soon anyone caught resisting collectivization was branded a kulak and taken away to make his contribution to Stalin's 5-year plan.
Я з кількома порадився своїми близькими, і ми давай.
A few close friends and I got together and we began to organize a resistance group.
Таку, щоб була би зброя.
But then, as we were trying to buy arms, somebody we asked told the police, and we were arrested. Some managed to run away, but I got 5 years hard labor and was taken to the construction site of the Volga White Sea Canal.
Яка зателефонувала.
I was put to work on deepening the bed of the canal, which was being dug out of the rock. There were 2 of us to a team. One would be holding a long crowbar and the second would be hitting it with a mallet weighing 8 kilograms. The work norms were backbreaking. Many people died, mostly because we had to work without any rest. 7 days every week and 10 hours every day. There were no free days, nothing, just work and work. And no matter what the weather was like, in wind, frost or snowstorm, people were driven to work on the canal. Completely exhausted, they would sink to the ground or fall over, and the snow would soon cover them. They would be left there.
Collectivization was made out to be a great victory for the party and Russia as a whole, but in fact it brought disaster. Though every tractor was treated as a triumph for socialist agriculture, only a fraction of the machinery promised by Stalin at the start of the campaign ever materialized. Meanwhile, millions of peasants destroyed their possessions rather than let the collective farms have them. Half of Russia's horses and cattle, and over 2/3 of all its sheep and goats were slaughtered. Vast tracts of land remained untilled. And after the requisitioning raids of the police, most of the villages were left without even the seed grains for the sowing season. So instead of raising yields, collectivization brought famine, such as Russia had not seen even at the time of the Civil War.
І ми знали про голод, що в Україні голод.
Prisoners coming to the camp brought news of the growing famine in the Ukraine. They came in trainloads and told us of people dying of starvation. My wife wrote that our neighbor had died and that my uncle had died. They had been young, healthy people. Why had they died? My wife couldn't say, but I knew, and my brother died also.
Stalin's industrialization campaign was, like collectivization, a rational policy pushed to mad extremes. A year after the start of the 5-year plan, he replaced its targets with figures which his own economists thought unattainable. Stalin dismissed the experts daring to doubt his plans, and a whole generation of enthusiasts threw themselves into his campaign, fired by the impossible challenge he set them. Vladimir Voronel, a young engineer at the time, was one of those enthusiasts.
Меня распределили в Махачкала, в Дагестан.
I was sent to the town of Makhachkala in Dagestan. That's in the northern Caucasus. They sent me to Derbend, one of the most ancient cities. As a matter of fact, I didn't even know it existed until I graduated. A huge cannery was to be built there. Because there were no experts available at the time, I was sent there and I was all enthusiasm. I felt it was my duty to go and work on a construction project. So I was very pleased to go to Dagestan.
И поэтому с удовольствием поехал в Дагестан.
We faced enormous difficulties. There were not enough qualified people. Also, because bread was being rationed, before we could take on any extra workers, we had to get extra ration cards so that they would have something to eat. And bread was short. So there was a strict limit on how many workers we could take on. In addition, there was a shortage of fuel, of electric power, even of water for the construction work. So there were enormous problems. But I must say that we worked with great enthusiasm. We were young people and worked far beyond the 8-hour day. And despite all the formidable obstacles, got the job done.
Our century will continue in a moment on A&E.
To cheer his people on, Stalin kept up a barrage of propaganda extolling the successes of his industrialization drive. Soon he was promising the country that the 5-year plan would in many respects be completed in 4 years, or even 3.5. But he also introduced incentive schemes, such as Russia had not seen since the 1917 revolution. He set his workforce strict norms which they had to fulfill if they wanted to earn even a basic living wage. At the same time, he offered an array of bonuses and privileges to people who did more than the norm. And he started up a whole shock worker movement designed to show that the impossible was attainable. Its greatest hero was to be a Donbass miner, Alexei Stakhanov, who allegedly fulfilled his norm 14 times over. And Stalin went on raising the norms, presenting his industrialization drive as Russia's life and death struggle against what he called hostile capitalist encirclement. She had to modernize herself in a decade or go under. Comrades, the pace must not be slackened. On the contrary, we must quicken it as much as is within our powers. This is dictated by our obligations to the workers and peasants of the USSR. This is dictated by our obligations to the working class of the whole world. To slacken the pace would be to lag behind, and those who lag behind are beaten. We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this lag in 10 years. Either we do it, or they crush us. As Stalin himself was to admit later, none of the targets of the 5-year plan came near to being realized. If anything, the insane pace dictated by him led to insane waste of materials and effort and plain chaos. Shortages of food and goods, worse than they had been for years, were the result. Industrial accidents grew frequent and assumed disastrous proportions. He blamed it all on saboteurs inspired or financed from abroad. The show trials of so-called saboteurs, accompanied by mass meetings to demand death for the enemies of the people, became a regular feature of the 5-year plan. Defendants were pressured, cajoled, blackmailed into admitting to preposterous charges of plotting to undermine the Soviet economy. High-level planning officials were said to have formed a secret organization called the Industrial Party, with the aim of wrecking the 5-year plan on orders from French politicians. They went to prison for up to 15 years. Another group of saboteurs, supposedly in the pay of the West, were put on trial and shot for deliberately producing food shortages. And fantastic as may have been the charges, they carried a degree of conviction for a good many people.
и процессы, которые проходили, вот, мы считали...
As for the trials that were taking place, many of us, myself included, felt that there had to be some truth in the charges, like the trial of the so-called Industrial Party. We felt there could be no smoke without fire. Most of the engineers felt that if someone had been arrested and put on trial, it meant that definitely they must have done something.
And instead of lowering the targets, Stalin continued piling on the pressure. As Russia's absolute ruler, able to make his people and his party jump to his will, he refused to grasp that reality itself lay beyond his sway. Pictured as the supreme planner, he put the ideas of the party's radicals into practice, using all of his superb talent for manipulation and his single-mindedness of purpose, his enormous organizing abilities and genius for propaganda. But he seemed no more to understand the economics involved than to care about the suffering he inflicted on the country. In fact, he and his followers seemed to revel in the idea of sacrifices as a source of inspiration for the people. Films about deadly sabotage drew from that source. The path to Russia's brilliant future was strewn with dangers, they said. But the people had to make good, through even more heroic effort, the harm done by enemies trying to derail the train of Stalin's industrial revolution. The battle to industrialize Russia was bound to have casualties, but to die in that battle was a hero's death. In November 1932, Stalin's wife, Nadezhda Alleluyeva, committed suicide. 22 years younger than Stalin and mother of his two children, this devoted and affectionate woman could no longer stand what he was doing to the country. After a celebration to mark the anniversary of the 1917 revolution, where she burst out about Russia's sufferings and the growing terror, only to be rudely shut up by her husband, she went home and shot herself. Stalin gave her a state funeral, which he did not attend. In 5 cataclysmic years, Stalin had changed the face of Russia. He had pushed new railways across the landscape and planted factories where nothing had stood before. But vast areas of the country lay devastated. And while his followers could feel proud of what they had built, the peasant masses, who were the bulk of his people, were seething with hatred of Stalin, the visionary tyrant. In the party itself, signed memoranda were being passed around, calling on the leadership to depose him. But he had pushed the country down a road along which there was no turning back. From now on, his industrialization drive, his disregard of the sacrifices he was imposing on his people, and his deafening propaganda to present it all as the march to paradise were to remain basic features of his reign. And far from trying to soothe the hatred he had excited, in the next 5 years he was to provoke the country and his party more cruelly than ever before. And he was to triumph over them by applying terror such as Russia had never seen.